And so we wanted to hear about what aspects of federal overreach they discussed at the summit, and then also what types of actions that maybe we can take, what kinds of issues we can work on. So Chad and Rynnieva, welcome.
Technical title is Senate Majority Counsel, and one of my job objectives is that I'm to oversee and review, analyze, and act if necessary on state and federal conflict issues. I also assist Senator Coghill with his role as chairman of Judiciary, and one of my other functions is to advance the goals of the Senate majority, whether that be drafting bills, advising as to legal concepts, or writing letters, so on and so forth. Rynnieva Moss is joining me. She is the chief of staff for Senator Coghill. She was one of the prime architects of the Federal Overreach Summit that we just had on August 12th through the 13th down in Anchorage. One of the other players in the summit itself is the Citizens Advisory Commission on Federal Areas, otherwise known as CACFA. And essentially this is a commission made up of 12 commissioners, including Representative Wes Keller down from Wasilla and Senator Coghill. The commission itself, CACFA, was started by Representative Mike Kelly a few years ago. As far as the Federal Overreach Summit itself, CACFA and invited guests went down to the Denina Center a few weeks ago, and the intent was to focus on action points for state officials, residents, and federal officials. There's been a lot of discussion about the overall frustration with the federal government and the perceived overreach that it has in parks, preserves, refuges, you name it. One of the goals of this summit, as suggested by Ms. Moss, was to actually come up with points of direction upon which people can do something about it. And so the way we did that is we made sure that we incorporated all of the architects and the people that understand some of our most relevant laws that affect the state, and that is the Native Claims Settlement Act, the Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act, NILCA, and the Statehood Compact. We basically wanted to get them all together, make sure that we got their information. That information is lost forever. A lot of them are older, and they are truly treasures to the state of Alaska. When they leave, a lot of institutional knowledge is going to be gone forever. So one of the purposes of Federal Overreach Summit was to record this, get the information in a digital form so we can have it to go forward and it can be passed on for generations, because that's, in our view, critically important. Primary emphasis of the Federal Overreach Summit was an emphasis on land access and natural resource development. And one of the common themes that was explained to everybody in attendance that the federal government are using unorthodox ways to infringe on state and private landowner authority. And some examples include using the Clean Water Act to prevent potential development of Pebble Mine. That's one of the most famous examples right now, and using the Endangered Species Act to prevent landowners from accessing their land or developing their land under the guise that you have to protect the habitat of an alleged threatened or endangered species. So the federal government and its agencies, they are becoming more creative and more aggressive on ways to prevent the state from developing its own resources. So that's obviously a major concern to many in the private sector. That's a major concern to people that understand the Alaska Statehood Compact, and it's well known that Alaska is supposed to use its natural resources to become self-sufficient. If it's not self-sufficient, then we're left with a situation where the federal government, unfortunately, is used to continue funding for us, and that's not something that the majority of the people that attended the summit want to see continue. They want to see some sort of self-sufficiency from the state, and the way that is done in the eyes of many is natural resource development. So, who attended the summit? Senator Murkowski, Senator Begich, Representative Young, and Governor Parnell all attended, and they all gave speeches and assessments as to what they perceived, what federal overreach was, where it exists, and what are their concerns and potential solutions. We also received a lot of valuable input from some of the architects and some of the people that have been fighting for states' rights, essentially, for decades. One was Ron Somerville. He's an ANILCA expert. One was Tina Cunning. She's a longtime ANILCA coordinator that's down in Anchorage. There was Ed Fogels, who was the DNR deputy commissioner. Michael Garrity, the attorney general, spoke. Bill Horn, the former assistant secretary of the Interior, was there and gave his assessment as to the problems. And we also heard from folks that are directly affected even to this day with lawsuits against the federal government. John Sturgeon was in attendance and gave his first-hand account about the problems he's been having with the federal government and his ongoing lawsuits. So there's lots of great insight there. So what were the problems? What were the problems, and how do we look to assess and come up with solutions? Well, one of the problems that was commonly referred to is that there's aggressive rules being made and enforced by federal agencies against Alaskans, and that often comes past in the form of federal agencies expanding their jurisdiction beyond what many feel to be the appropriate jurisdiction. There was discussion about slow federal government creep and expansion when it comes to access and natural resource development, and that's a violation of the No More Clause found in ANILCA. Here's a great example. There's now a perceived influence beyond the borders of some of our national parks, and what the federal government is calling these, or trying to call these, is buffer zones. They're essentially trying to regulate some of the fish and game provisions beyond the parks themselves. They're saying that, well, because the animals migrate to and from the park, that we should also have an additional buffer zone, even if that's on state land, even if that's on private land, even if that's on native land. That's a problem that came up during the summit. There's also what many believe to be a coordinated suffocation of state and private interest inland for some of these federal areas. These oftentimes are mining claims that existed prior to statehood, and the perception is that some of these directors of the national parks, some of these directors of the appropriate federal agencies are doing whatever they can via regulation to suffocate and deny access to these mining claims, which ultimately will cause them to go away because these private individuals don't have the resources to fight the full power and assets that the federal government can come to bear. So that was another problem that we addressed. There's also the knowing and unknowing ignorance of the Statehood Act by federal agents. I recently attended a conference down in Anchorage regarding ANILCA, and it was staggering to see that 70% of the federal employees and future directors of the parks, the Forest Service, whether it be BLM, they'd been in the state for less than 3 years, and there was another 40% out of that figure that had only been in the state for a year. And to say that their knowledge of the Native Claims Settlement Act, ANILCA, and the Statehood Compact was low is giving them a lot of credit. So that's what you're dealing with, all the way from the directors to the staff to the agents that are actually enforcing the rules. There's a limited knowledge of the special circumstances that pertain to Alaska. Many of them are from California, Oregon, places on the West Coast. They need to understand that Alaska is an entirely different animal in a lot of different respects. Here's another problem that came to fruition, is that there's a policy and rulemaking that is being made and enforced by individual federal directors, and it's being implemented unilaterally without being placed in the Federal Register or allowed to have public comment. So essentially they're creating rules and regulations that are being sprung on individual Alaskans that are trying to make their way in the designated federal area, and there's no public comment period or notice being given prior to the rule coming to being. So it literally comes from nowhere, from the eyes of many people. That's a problem that was something that needed to be corrected by many folks at the summit. A great example of this, this was submitted to us by the governor's office, was there was an internal RS-2477 memo. And RS-2477 is a access claim to historic mining rights that existed prior to a certain date, and it guarantees people access to their mining claims, essentially on federal lands, as long as it's designated by the state. There was an internal memo that came to our attention that stated that the federal government was no longer going to acknowledge RS-2477 claims from any future Alaskans. That's an abrupt change from what their previous policy was, and this is something that never went in the Federal Register, and it's something that never was vetted via a comment period as per their normal procedure. They're supposed to have a scoping period. They're supposed to go through usually an EIS segment. None of that occurred, and that's something that many people find alarming. So what are the solutions, and what can we do? There's a few things that, and I'll start off with what the state can do. I'll talk about what the federal government can do, and then I'll talk about what the individual citizen can do, because everybody can contribute in some way or another to help remedy some of these problems. One of the suggestions that was given to us was that the state needs to survey the 36 million acres that have been improved or transferred, but not necessarily surveyed under ANCSA and ANILCA. That hasn't occurred yet, and the intent is to potentially allocate more funds to make sure that we have the resources able to do that. Obviously, a lot of that land, there's not roadway access. It's in the middle of very harsh terrain in some circumstances. There was in testimony that the DNR or the state should be given the resources in order to make sure that that land is surveyed, so it can be helpful for the state of Alaska going forward. There is also another solution that the state can do. It's advocating for continued fundings of patents from DNR. There was a suggestion that an allocation of resources should occur for continuing education for state and federal agencies about the promises of statehood, the Native Claims Settlement Act, and ANILCA. The average amount of understanding of each of those three laws in the assessment of many in DNR and the governor's office and many state senators and representatives is that the average staff or employee that you're dealing with in the federal government, and to be frank, some of the state departments, is lower than where it should be. Another solution was that they are looking to file quiet title actions in federal courts in the event that negotiations are unsuccessful with regards to disagreements over a land policy between the state and the feds. There is a consideration that we're going to cancel certain memorandums of understanding with the federal government, and the way those memorandums of understandings work, they're known as MOUs, and they are agreements between, for example, BLM and Fish and Game with regards to who's going to manage the wildlife resources in a federal area. And one of the goals that came out of the summit, in addition to the other ones that we're talking about today, is that all of those MOUs should be disclosed to the public so everybody understands, what the state is supposed to do, what their authority pertains to, and what the federal government authority is. The MOUs are less common, but they should be disclosed, and that's one of the things that I know Senator Coghill has made a priority, to get all those memorandums of understanding in one place and disclose it to people like CACFA and various state officials, so people have a chance, and then in turn they're given to the citizens, so they understand the agreements that are going on that you're not necessarily going to find in a Federal Register. You're not necessarily going to find in any sort of statute or regulation, but they exist, and they definitely have an effect on individual Alaskans. If the federal government does not cooperate pursuant to some of these memorandums of understanding, the suggestion was given that the state should pull out of the MOUs and look to operate of its own accord, using its resources to manage the fish and game, for example. Whatever the violation, whatever the appropriate department is, that agency potentially could unilaterally manage itself and its own resources, if the federal government is found to be a bad operator. Alaska should also oppose any future wild and scenic river designation, and if it comes up during a scoping period, individual Alaskans and state agencies should make sure that comments are given to whatever federal agency is doing the scoping process, to notify those agents that we do not want any more wild, scenic, and river designations. And the practical effect, of course, is that if a river is deemed wild and scenic, then there's a very, very low probability of any future resource development, and there's a very, very low probability of making sure that access is granted the way that the majority of Alaskans that have been communicating with this office and communicating with Representative Keller's office would like to see. They also talked about an ANILCA position, specifically in Alaska Fish and Game, to make sure they have somebody that totally understands the Act and can advise and teach the agents of Fish and Game as necessary, so they're aware when they're dealing and negotiating with the federal agencies. There was an interesting comment that was brought up regarding with what was known as Beringia, and that's something that few of us had heard before, but apparently there's an international movement to have international national parks, and Beringia is an area that extends from Russia and in theory is supposed to go through Alaska and Canada. Russia has already signed on to an agreement that essentially discloses future developments in this particular area. And the concern is, particularly with the Obama administration, that they will look to instill some sort of UN policy where all these nations agree that because of climate change and because of protection of endangered and threatened species, that it should all be an international park, which was a concern that was very troubling to many state agents, particularly because the proposed area is in a large section of northern Alaska, which many, including Prudhoe Bay, that in the area around Prudhoe Bay, which obviously is full of natural resources. So so that was a concern, and that's something that the state is continuing to monitor and will comment as necessary to ensure that the Obama administration does not look to join Russia and other countries that are looking to institute this. We then talked about what the federal government can do. One of the biggest issues that were brought up for our purposes was reviving what's known as the Land Use Council, and that was a council that came from the Native Claims Settlement Act and ANILCA, which forced the state and the federal government to talk and compromise or come up with a solution, a viable solution, upon which management of state and federal lands would. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no,
is there a question?
No, keep going, Mike. Keep going, Jeff. Sorry about that.
Okay, very good. So basically, it was a land use council. It previously existed back in the early 80s. It's since dissolved, and the problem with not having it there is that it opens the gate for more potential lawsuits, which the state has been involved in on a semi-regular basis now when it comes to the access issues. The intent behind the Land Use Council was to ensure that it never gets to that point and they're not spending the resources, and many saw that to be a fruitful alternative, cost-effective alternative to resolving some of the state and federal access concerns. And so the suggestion given to the federal delegation was they should look to enforce and reimpose the Land Use Council. The Feds should also look via Murkowski, Senator Begich, and Representative Young regarding curriculum and development for ANILCA and ANSCA education for all of their federal agents and federal directors that are doing work in the state. People also talked about wilderness designations and how the federal delegation should write a sunset clause which states that all wilderness designations should have an expiration date and should be reassessed after a period of time. There was talk about revising the Endangered Species Act, and this may or may not come to fruition. It depends on how many western states might be supportive of the idea. But they talked about revising the Endangered Species Act so that it identified population objectives in recovery plans, which, if it was reached, then it would trigger a delisting process. So, for example, if you have an endangered or a threatened population of polar bears, and the polar bears or the ring seals or whatever, the beluga whales, if they reach 1,000 animals in a certain area, then that would trigger a delisting process. Right now, there's nothing in the Endangered Species Act that allows that process to occur, and the common prevailing thought is that should be added to the Endangered Species Act at some point in time in the future. The problem, of course, that you have now is that you don't necessarily have the genetic makeup in the Senate to get that through, but that should be a long-term objective of any Alaska delegation member. They also stated that the Quiet Title Act should be amended to allow the state quiet title to its land by forcing the federal government to either assert an interest or concede title. The problem that we have here is that the federal courts can basically disclaim even taking up the issue of quiet title on some of the land, and that's a continual problem. Alaska continually wants to make sure that quiet title is resolved. The federal government, for whatever reason, does not have the same motivation to address the issues, probably because they like, when in doubt, having the power. That's one prevailing thought. So the answer and the conclusion that was given out of the summit was that the federal delegation should look to revise that Quiet Title Act. So the federal government has to make assessments and has to do an analysis on some of these land issues between the state and the feds. The state of Alaska has done a pretty good job of collaborating with other states, but they should continue that collaboration, particularly with western states. Utah is a great example. They have aggressively pursued some of their RS-2477 interests, and they have federal lands in their state. And most of the western states have a large portion of federal lands taking up the area. None have as much as Alaska, but we all have common interests in access and natural resources development. The state of Alaska should look to partner with western states to build coalitions in Congress whenever possible. People in Alaska, state agents, federal agents, everybody should oppose future wild and scenic river designations. That was something that particularly the federal delegation could look into and oppose. There was a question about navigable waters and what the feds can do about it. The suggestion was that the federal government and the delegation should look to make a clear definition as to what is sufficient watercraft in order for it to be included as navigable waters, which the state would take control and authority of. Right now, the definition for a sufficient watercraft hasn't been delineated to the point that satisfies many in DNR. The suggestion is that a true, accurate, concise definition would alleviate some of the uncertainty about what would be sufficient for navigable waters designations, and we would recommend that the federal delegation work with DNR to resolve that. Department of Interior must create an annual report regarding the minerals in the state of Alaska. They're required to do so under ANILCA, and they initially did it the first few years after ANILCA in the early 80s. They since have stopped doing this. The federal delegation should put pressure on the Department of Interior to re-engage and force them to do annual reports regarding the mineral deposits around the state. If there's a belief that if people realize what sort of natural resources we are talking about on some federal areas, that would garner success in allowing other Western states to join with us to push some pro-Alaska, pro-development legislation. BLM should look to evaluate and remove some of these existing wilderness designations, and the same sort of analysis applies to the Endangered Species Act, that at some points in time you have to do an intelligent review of the current wilderness designations and reassess depending on what the needs of the surrounding communities are, if there has been some sort of resource development, if there are some sort of access issues. BLM should be forced and pressure should be put on them from the federal delegation to reevaluate and potentially remove any some of the existing wilderness designations. The last concern that I'll talk about regarding the federal government, what the federal delegation can do is they do want pressure put on some of the park services to eliminate the de facto buffer zones around the park. There's been a slow government creep, and the area around Denali National Park is a great example. There's been a slow attempt beyond what you find in the Federal Register to enforce and implement rules and create a de facto buffer zone around the park itself, and it affects Alaskans living in the community that are looking to take advantage of some of the wildlife resources around the area. The buffer zones, the concern, of course, is that the buffer zones, where does it end, and does that start to extend for other federal land management agencies? Is it going to extend in the Forest Service, BLM, the preserves, the refuge? That there's genuine concern that that's perhaps the first domino, and that sort of behavior and thinking by the federal director of the park will spread to other federal agencies. So the last portion of what we want to talk about is some of the things that individual Alaskans can do in order to solve some of these issues. The first and most important one is that everybody is encouraged to participate in the comment periods for the scoping and management plans of federal areas, and this includes the national forests, the parks, the preserves. Some great examples currently that are ongoing include the White Mountain National Recreational Area, the BLM land issues, the national park land, the EPA, and Pebble Mine. I encourage folks to look at the CACFA website, the Commission for Federal Area website, and I encourage them to subscribe to the Alaska Lands Update, because that update does a great service to the people of Alaska. It shows them the comment periods where these federal agencies, which, as I stated earlier, a lot of them are run by people that are new to the state or are not familiar with the history of Alaska. It helps for Alaskans that have been living and affected by the rules and regulations to actually have some sort of input. And the concern is if that input isn't given, then they're not necessarily going to know, because of their short time in the state and their inability maybe to understand ANILCA and ANSCA. They're going to promulgate regulations that will have a damaging impact on many of the Alaskans that actually live in the community. So we encourage everybody to check the CACFA website and to sign up for the Alaska Lands update. The second major point that I would like to point out is that we should be in constant communication with the Alaska and federal legislators. Many conservatives, of course, are predominantly in tune with some of the issues that we're talking about today, but the focus should be on the moderates that may or may not necessarily be aware or understand the ramifications upon which is occurring in the state on a regular basis. So communication with some of the moderate Republicans, I think, would be a wise course of action. The third thing that people talked about, much like John Sturgeon, is that we encourage the citizens and the folks from Alaska to make the state aware of potential lawsuits that may involve a federal overreach issue. You know, sometimes the state can act as an intervener and look to assert some of the interests that have been brought up by DNR, and to make sure that it can help combat perceived federal overreach. So we encourage folks, if you're aware of a lawsuit that you think might affect state interests, the encroachment of federal government on private interests, on native lands, that you coordinate with our office, Representative Keller's office, or contact DNR or the Department of Law. There's certainly an interest by the upper echelon in state government to get involved with these suits and fight the federal government aggressively when it comes to overreach on access and natural resource development. The fourth thing I'd recommend to folks is to read the promises in the Statehood Compact, ANILCA, and ANSCA. It is important knowledge to have with you, and it is something that I think will be fruitful, particularly as the older generations retire or move out of some of the department heads with the state of Alaska. There's new generations taking over. It's important to make sure that everyone is aware, particularly as the decades go by, about the promises that were made in the Statehood Act, in ANILCA, and in ANSCA. And essentially what it all boils down to is that the state of Alaska should be self-sufficient. They should have access to their natural resources in order to wean itself off the federal government. And now the fifth thing and the final thing that I have before I pass it on to Rynnieva to see if she has any additional comments is that I encourage you to vote for people that understand the problem. And what I really mean by that is, some of the Republican primaries, the primary candidates should be challenged to see how much their understanding of ANILCA, ANSCA, and the Statehood Act, and how much they actually know. I think that would be wise to go with, my personal preference, I suppose. Take it for what it's worth, but it'd be wise to go with people that understand these problems and understand there is a prevailing amount of federal government creep, and the people that are in tune with this will be able to come up with more viable solutions in order to fight back and make sure that Alaska is self-sufficient. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rynnieva Moss. Rynnieva Moss was the architect of the Federal Overreach Summit, and she's the Chief of Staff for Senator John Coghill.
Good evening, everyone. I think Chad did a really good job of describing the summit. I just wanted to touch on a couple of pretty basic things, and that is we have to challenge the rulemaking process. It's obvious that federal employees are making laws that have no statutory authority, and we need to challenge that wherever we can. Ron Somerville made a very compelling argument about the memorandums of understanding. We have to enforce full faith of those memorandums of understanding, and if the feds aren't willing to do that, then we need to terminate the MOUs. But to just summarize the whole summit, I think what we need to do is we need to impress on the congressional delegation that what the federal bureaucracy is doing to Alaska is not funny, and each action has a huge consequence, and we need to start challenging what the federal government has done to this state. That was the purpose of the summit, to draw a line in the sand and say, we are going to get very educated, we are going to start asserting our state's rights, and we are going to use the principles of law, not philosophical differences with federal agencies. All of the presentations are online at CACFA's site. We will be transcribing those that are not in written form. The whole summit was videotaped and will be loaded onto CACFA's site and the legislative site, so you can watch the whole summit. And this isn't the end of the process. The next meeting of CACFA is October 3rd, 4th, and 5th. The meeting will be in Anchorage, and people will have an opportunity to testify to the commission at that time. But I know that people that are listening can become very involved. We do need to start challenging what the federal government is doing in their unwritten laws. They are actually implementing to the force of a congressional piece of legislation rules that they are writing in the form of policy that don't even get published in the CFR. So we need to be vigilant.
And that's the end of our presentation. If there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Both Steve and I are on the side.
It's Chad. Chad, this is Joe Miller. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Joe.
Hey, I think you guys put on a great presentation tonight. I apologize that I wasn't there at the Overreach Summit. I was actually with my son at his acceptance day at West Point. But one of the things I had a question about with respect to the Overreach Summit, and I also would like, of course, your input on this as well. As you're probably well aware, all of the delegation and most of our state legislators, in fact, perhaps all of them now at this time, are supportive of adoption of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And one of the big concerns that I have about that international treaty, which is at least as of 2010 within one vote of confirmation in the U.S. Senate, is that it doesn't just extend international jurisdiction over waters, but it also has the real capacity to extend international governance by EPA-type regulations over inland entities that are disposing or have affluence into inland waters, then dump into international waters. And in fact, there was a case involving a factory in the United Kingdom that actually extended international, basically covenants, jurisdiction implications on its operations because of just that fact. The effluents were determined to come out of the factory that entered the river that then entered into the ocean waters. I think that's substantial, yet another avenue of, at this point, of course, it would be international overreach, but it would its conduit, of course, would be through federal action. Is that seen by any quarters that are looking at the federal overreach issues as being a threat, and if not, why?
Disclose to the members of CACFA to ensure that they're aware of that issue. It was phrased to us that the ongoing concern from their perspective was this Rynnieva, which is essentially an international park and preserve. That was the focus that we had at the summit. But I think your points are well heeded, and that is something that we'll have further discussions on. Perhaps we can bring that up at the October 3rd, 4th, and 5th meeting. When that's when we expect to have the other half of this discussion. And that'll include members from federal agencies and just citizens from around Alaska too, to have their testimony. So that's a great point, Joe, and we'll make sure that gets some sort of assessment.
Joe, this is Rynnieva.
Yeah, go ahead.
What would be helpful is for you to send a letter to Senator Coghill with that concern. You and I share the same concern about the law of the sea treaty. And they actually, when they were pushing legislation through the state legislature 2 years ago on the coastal zone management, there was a mentality there for judge development inland based on the fact that our rivers all end up in the ocean. So every kind of development happens in this state goes through the coastal zone management process. So it's the danger is there.
Right, and these folks that are in charge of these international bodies are the same people that brought us Kyoto, which obviously was not adopted directly by the United States. But, I mean, these are radical environmentalists that are against, human development, that are in some cases against humankind themselves. And it would be a radical truncation of our ability to develop industry to go down that route. Yet, I mean, it amazes me at the number of people in this state embracing that as the way forward. And I think it's a short-sighted thing, and I really do give you accolades, Chad, for taking on, agreeing to put that forward later this fall, and I'd be happy to try to provide input for that as well, because it's a very important issue to me for not just that reason, but a number of others. Obviously, everybody knows where I'm at on the United Nations.
Well, Joe, it's interesting you brought up the term human, because we had a woman from Iliamna testify at the summit, and she was talking about how the life of people in Iliamna has improved so much because of the Pebble Project. And she said that the environmentalists are looking at every way to stop that, except for the impact that it's had on the humans in the area and the improvement of their lifestyle.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, that's all I have. I'm actually getting ready to travel to an area where I'm probably going to lose cell signal, but I'm sure there are many other questions, but I want to thank you very much for your presentation tonight. It's exceptionally informative, and wish you Godspeed on the remainder of the project.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. We really appreciate the insight.
Okay. Bye, Joe. This is Maria, and I just wanted to let you all know we are at the end of our hour, but if you can take a couple of the questions that we've got online, Cassie will go ahead and unmute some of those questions for you for a few minutes.
Okay, we'd be happy to.
All right. Thank you.